Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, dear participants. I'm happy to welcome you once again for the 5 days faculty development program sponsored by ATL and hosted by College of Management, SRM IST, Kattangolipuri campus. And we are now going to start session number 9, coping up with stress. Here, Dr. David Zawahar, sir, he is with us. He's director, Xavier Institute of Management and Entrepreneurship, Chennai, and he was a former registrar, University of Madras. I'm happy to introduce our chief guest for the day. He has over 25 years of experience in research, academics, and academic administration. He is a proud recipient of Devang Mehta National Award for the Best HR Teacher in the year 2009. He has served in senior positions in prestigious institutions like NIT Trichy, Bharatidasan Institute of Management, and University of Madras. He served as a registrar of University of Madras. He has traveled widely to several countries in the East and West, and also he's a certified trainer in transactional analysis. So here we have Sir with us for dealing the title on coping up with stress. Sir, on behalf of College of Management, SRM IST, we are happy to welcome you for the session 9 of this 5 days faculty development program.
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, David, sir, for joining us, especially for the past 2.5 days. We are having sessions fully on technology and technology disruption. So we are like, we want to be away from this for some time. And so all of us, we are looking forward to your session. And so I think this will definitely help us to overcome our stress level. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am. Can I start?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay. First, a very good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for this very warm reception. And it's been very many years since I've actually seen Dr. Kavita Shanmugam, a long time back.
Yes.
I have seen her as a student. And
more than 20 years. I think we are associated for nearly 20 years.
Correct. And it is nice to be associated with SRM. SRM has been in the news in recent days. You know, so many special events have been happening there, and their founder chairman's birthday was celebrated yesterday. And of course, under the new leadership, the SRM University has grown in leaps and bounds and is one of the topmost universities in India today. And it's always a pleasure to be associated with such an university. And what makes the afternoon more enjoyable for me is the fact that this is the topic on which I did my PhD. My PhD was on stress management and coping strategies. And I'm also impressed by the number of doctors who are here, doctors and professors who are here. This is a very unique experience, talking to very senior academicians, people who have already accomplished quite a lot in their lives. But this is one topic you will all agree is absolutely applicable universally to almost everybody in this program. There's not a single person here who has not been touched by stress or who has not been impacted by stress. And we have come to that stage in our lives where we have started thinking that there's nothing much that we can do with stress. Along with the developments, along with the advancements that life and technology brings, stress is a necessary evil that we have to live with. And maybe we are not wrong when we conclude like that, saying that stress is indeed something that we are going to live with. But even when we have decided that we are going to live with the devil, it is often better to know a little bit more about the devil, so that when the time comes and the opportunity presents itself, we can prevail over the devil, or maybe eliminate the devil altogether. So depending on what is your viewpoint of stress, it would differ. The conclusion would differ. But what I am going to do is essentially, it's a very short presentation. What I hope to do is for about 90 minutes or so, I shall share some of my thoughts on stress and well-being with you. And after that, of course, you can ask me questions. Some questions on your current scenario. It could be about home, it could be about workplace, it could be about society and how stress is being generated, which is beyond the scope of possibly my lecture. I'm open for that also. So I don't intend to keep you, listening to my lecture for the next 2 hours. That would be very boring. I also encourage you at any point during my lecture, should you be requiring some clarification, please put up your hand. And I would stop and try to answer your question. And there is always the chat box, which is available for us. So before I begin, once again, congratulations to Dr. Kavita Shanmugam and team for having done an excellent job in organizing this. And in these sort of COVID times, getting the entire contingent of participants to come and participate and to keep them here is a very, very difficult job. But they have done it magnificently, and therefore congratulations are due. So let me, without wasting time, get down to the business of sharing my slides with you. Now, this topic, stress and well-being, is, as I have earlier mentioned, is something that seems to have affected us in a very big way. And some of the consequences of stress are truly discouraging. When we hear about students, young people, unable to cope with stress, and they turn to issues like drugs or certain unapproved behaviors, we wonder what is going on. And it is not just about school children or very young children that we talk about. Nobody seems to be spared of the impact of stress. Great corporates, we were doing a small survey on corporate leaders. And one thing that we found was very, very disturbing. We found that there were not too many corporate leaders who lived beyond the age of 70. In academics and in certain other fields, you would find people well above 80, 90 still hanging around. But in the corporate world, we found that there were not too many corporate leaders beyond the age of 70. Yes, you could always give me some examples of people who are 75, 78 and all that. But the great bulk of the people seem to have gone missing. And sadly, the answer is simple. They are no longer with us. The corporate world was seen as the only the place of great stress. But that has also changed. The classrooms in a school have become stressful. The teachers themselves, who chose another field of operation and said, we will become teachers, thought that they would have a better balance of life and they would find it easier to be here. But their case also does not seem to be any better. Doctors, engineers, any professionals, young, old, man, woman, everybody seems to be greatly impacted by the stress. So therefore, if we are really going to talk about how do we counter stress, we first need to know the enemy. We first need to understand what does stress really mean. Because without an understanding of stress, it would be impossible to talk about well-being at work or in life in general. So therefore, I necessarily have to talk a lot about the concept of stress. And if in the process, you get a little feeling that this is academic in nature, please wait till the end of my session, where we will necessarily be talking about how do we cope with stress? How do we overcome this? So this is the prelude that I wanted to give you before we started this lecture on stress. Now comes this basic point where we have to define what really is stress. As you read through various books, especially these inspirational books and these small 50-page, 60-page books, which have become very popular hot sellers, everybody has their own definition of what is stress. And, you know, one easy conclusion that we can come to is that stress is a very difficult concept to define. It seems to have different meanings for different people. It is like the four blind people who are looking at an elephant, touching different parts of the elephant and concluding that the elephant is fat, thin, has a long nose, or whatever it is. While all of them may be partly correct, they're not completely correct. We would have to put together all of these experiences to really understand what is stress. Usually when we use the word stress, we are talking about the stress response. What do you do when a stressful situation is presented to you? The stressful situation can be caused by the situation itself, or another individual, or some sort of a scenario. What happens then? And the simplest way in which we can look at it is the unconscious preparation to fight or flee that a person experiences when faced with any demand. Now, this is a primitive state of the mind. This is the same man who was once upon a time a Neanderthal, the man who lived through Ice Age, the man who lived through the Rock Ages, the man who lived through the Metal Age, the man who lived through medieval times, and the modern man. But still the primitive man within us still lives. And when a sudden demand is made on us, any demand of any magnitude or from any quarters, when such a demand is made upon us, the first reaction that we give is an unconscious preparation to either fight and overcome that demand, or a sudden realization that this demand is too big for me to fight. Therefore, let me run away, which is what we call as the fight or flee preparation. Now, as I said, this is primitive. It has always been within us. Our DNA carries it for generations, for ages, for centuries. We have been prepared like this. Our entire body, our psyche has been prepared like this. So the moment a stress is presented to us, our first instinct is to fight or to flee. And the moment we make such a decision, our body needs to be ready for that, either to fight or to run away. And both of this we have to do with great energy. If you decide to fight, you will fight with everything, all that you have, so that you can overcome the stress. Or if you decide to flee, then you have to run away from the stressor as far away as possible in the quickest possible time. Again, in terms of energy, we are talking about tremendous amounts of energy that is required. Either to fight or to flee, you need lots and lots of energy. And I will explain in later stages how that happens. A stressor or a demand is the person or event that triggers the stress response. It can be a glass of water, a glass tumbler falling to the floor and breaking. That can trigger a stress response in us. The boss walking into the room unexpectedly can trigger a stress response. The phone ringing at, say, midnight, your mobile phone ringing at midnight can trigger a stress response. The sight of somebody that we have not seen for many years can trigger a stress response. Anything that triggers the stress response is called as a stressor, the reason for stress. Now, generally, when we talk about stress, we are actually referring to distress, because there's another type of stress which I will shortly be talking about. Whenever we talk about stress, we always talk about it in a negative form, in a derogatory manner. We talk about it because we are actually referring to distress. And this distress refers to the adverse physiological, psychological, behavioral, and organizational consequences that are likely to occur as a result of these stressful events. What does it mean? Why are we scared of stress? Is because it's not a fleeting moment. It leaves an impression. And where does it leave an impression? On your body. Physiologically, you become tired, drained. Your vision becomes blurred. You can't digest food. You seem to be losing hair. You seem to be gaining weight. All of these are basically stress symptoms, or it can be psychological, psychosomatic symptoms. You can't sleep at night. You have disturbing thoughts. You constantly feel that you're going to be persecuted. You feel that every day is a drag, that every day is a challenge that you will never ever overcome. Slowly you lose self-confidence on what you are capable of doing. And that in turn will also have behavioral consequences. Slowly people will start saying, I won't go to the staff meeting. I'll go 5 minutes late. What is the point in going there so early? Anyway, the HOD is going to scream at me, or somebody is going to tell me that I didn't do a job. Behavioral. And then if possible, if I have any casual leaves left, I'll take the casual leave on that day. It's a behavioral pattern. My sleeping patterns may change. The way that I relate to others may change. People will suddenly tell me, you're not like before. You've become more short-tempered. You're not listening to me when I'm talking to you. Are all essentially behavioral issues. But when you talk about physiological, psychological, or behavioral, it's only about the individual. But it doesn't stop with the individual. What it does is that it also has organizational consequences. An organization recruits an individual and employs an individual in the hope that this individual will exhibit a desired set of behaviors, will bring about performance, will help in achieving the organizational goals and objectives. But when the individual, who is the vehicle that will bring about performance and the achievement of objectives, is itself flawed or becomes a repaired unit, the organization will also suffer. The organization will suffer because the teams that it has created are no longer efficient because one member of the team is malfunctioning. The organizational objectives are compromised because one or few in the organization are no longer interested in what the organization is doing. Today we have a concept called employee disengagement. Modern research says that employees are engaged in an organization normally only for 2 years. After the second year, they become disengaged. What does that mean? They are physically present, but they are no longer committed to the organization goals and objectives as they were in the first 2 years. One of the reasons for such disengagement is stress, which is an organizational consequence. Now, this is going to cost the individual and the organization literally millions of dollars. Because as a candidate, an employee falling sick is not simply falling sick. The health insurance that follows, the work that needs to be done, the client dissatisfaction that needs to be met, the targets that you have set in the marketplace, how do we go get it? And the impact of this stressed person on all the other members in the organization are all organizational consequences, sometimes easily seen, but sometimes, mostly, we find that it is just under the surface, but still something that we have to pay a very heavy price for. So for that reason, we have to understand that stress is something that you can't say that, okay, let me sit and do, some positive thinking or some yoga or something like that, and it will all pass away. It may pass away, but unless you fully understand where does this come from, it becomes very difficult for us to handle stress. Now, however, all stress is not bad. Now, that is something that we need to understand. There is another stress, which is called as eustress. Eu is a Greek word for good. It literally means good stress. You see, when you're standing at just now the Olympics concluded, and I was watching the athletic races. And if you're looking at the 100 meters race, there are 3 phases in which they say, on your marks, there's some space, get set. And between the get set and the going off the gun, there is so much tension in the air. There is so much tension because all of the training that the athlete has taken, all of their abilities and capabilities are being energized, are being channelized for that one moment when the gun goes off. Now imagine somebody standing there at the gun, completely relaxed and saying, what, so what, I'll run fast. So there is no tension at all. And you will find no performance can come. Now, why are we talking about this? We are talking about this to just put it into our minds that stress is not always bad. And some amount of stress, if it brings about productivity, better performance, better exhibition of our capabilities and traits, then such stress is good. In fact, if you look at all of the excellence that we have reached, whether it be sports, whether it be science and technology, or whether it be in social advancements that we have made, they have all been brought about by eustress. Somewhere we said we wanted women empowerment. It created a stress in us that we must do something to liberate the women. And it brought about a particular, change in our society. Great changes are made. So stress is not always bad. When we do refer to stress, we often refer it to as distress. But let us be reminded, there's another side to it, which we shall call as eustress. Okay. Now, how do we approach the understanding of this thing called stress? There are actually 4 ways that we can approach stress to understand what it really means. There are 4 different ways. It ranges from the very primitive to the more sophisticated at the end of the continuum. Let me take you through each one of them and let's see what we can understand from it. Walter Cannon was the first man who said, this is basically a homeostatic or medical approach. What did he say? He said, see, stress, don't add too much color or whatever it is to it. It is all about what does the body do. And the body itself is designed to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium. Now, it's not a wrong opinion. If you were to talk to thyroid patients, one of the problems that thyroid patients have is that their extremities can become very cold or very hot. By extremities, I'm talking about the legs, feet, fingers, etc., etc. Now, for people who are healthy and the thyroid is functioning well, what the thyroid does is it brings about the balance in the body. And every other organ in the body is designed so as to bring about equilibrium. When the body becomes very warm, the skin starts excreting sweat. Water comes out of the pores. Why does it do? So that it can cool the skin, which otherwise would become blistered by the heat. So therefore, there is an equilibrium which is brought about. But when the water is sent out through the pores, another equilibrium is lost. The bodily fluids are lost. And so therefore, you start thinking about drinking water. Thirst is created in us. And the body says, please replenish all the water that has left your body by drinking more water. Therefore, this approach is not entirely wrong. In fact, it's a very sensible approach. It says all of this is to bring about equilibrium. So when I say I want to fight, I'm saying the status quo that I'm living in, I'm happy with it. But now that this new stressor has come, I will fight and overcome it. Why do I want to fight and overcome it? So that I can go back to the old times in which I was happy. Or I will flee and run away from this situation. Why? Because the equilibrium has been lost here. Let me go elsewhere and seek that equilibrium. So that is an interesting approach. But unfortunately, not everybody runs. Somebody sees a snake, they want to go and take it in their hands. You know, when you go to these zoological parks or the zoos, as they say, there is this famous python photograph that people want. Somebody wants to put the python on their shoulders and take a snap of it. And others are scared. Why does the python not frighten everybody the same way? If the homeostatic or medical approach, according to Walter B. Cannon, is correct, then everybody should be scared of the snake. Even small children, some of them are fascinated by flames. They want to play with fire, whereas some others are scared of it. Therefore, we need a different definition or an approach to understanding stress. So we call the next one as the cognitive appraisal approach. It was put forward by Richard Lazarus. He said that, see, the emphasis should be on the psychological and cognitive aspects of the response. Rather, in simple terms, it talks about the person-environment interaction and the person's cognitive appraisal in classifying events as stressful or not. What is he trying to say? He says, how have I cognized it? Now, talking about the word cognition, you know what does the word cognition stand for? We know the word recognition. If your father or your child or your spouse walked into this room, you would know immediately that this was your father or your mother or somebody. How do you do that? Because you have recognized. But what is the initial process called? Cognition is the act of knowing. And all of us have different ways of knowing certain things. A father is not a father to all the children. To some children, a father is a very strict person. To some children, a father is an ATM machine that you can take money from. To some children, a father is a joyful person who comes and plays with you. To some, father is a feared person with a very ill-tempered. So therefore, how have I cognized an event is very important. And the way that I have cognized it will decide how will I interact with the environment. That is why some people find something as challenging. Others find the same thing as fearful. Why is it fearful to some? Because they have cognized it as a fearful issue. And the way that they interact with something that is fearful is very difficult. Let me give you a practical example to get you to understand what I'm talking about. If you have ever been on the giant wheel, it's a terrifying experience. And you wonder, especially when you're at the top, what stupidity brought me to get into this giant wheel? Why did I ever do this? I should not have done this, is what you think. But there's also a combined joy, excitement racing through you. And you want to enjoy it as much as possible, isn't it? Now that is a cognition that this is a fun ride, that all people who want fun will do this. And so therefore, you look at this horrifying experience of putting people several feet above the ground, helpless. Even if they wanted to, they can't climb down. But it becomes a joyful experience because they have cognized it. They have understood it in a different way. So this was a powerful method of explaining why something seems stressful to some people and something seems not stressful to others. So a kid on a Diwali day, when he bursts these huge crackers, it's fun for him. There's nothing frightening for him. The bigger the bang, the bigger the joy. But for somebody inside the house, the bigger the sound, the bigger the nuisance it is. Exactly, because how do they appraise it? Again, talking of Diwali, look at all the human beings who enjoy it, and look at all the dogs and cats who are absolutely scared of all the noise that goes on. Why? Because they have cognized it differently. So therefore, there's a lot of sense in this approach also. Good, let's move on. But Robert Kahn, he said, it's all about the person-environment fit. And he said, this focuses on the social psychology of stress. He said, this is beyond the individual. It's not just the individual. We create environments and then we fit people into it. True, more or less. A college is created, then teachers are recruited. A corporation is created and people are recruited. You find that the organization comes first. So an environment is created. And then you find the people who will fit into that environment. Where the person fits in with the environment, there is no stress. They're perfectly happy. They can go to a 6 o'clock shift by getting up at 4 o'clock, driving through the dark lanes on a cold winter morning, reach the work at 6 o'clock, start the work at 6 o'clock, come back home for 2 o'clock, for the 2 o'clock lunch, take a nap, and they can live on. How do they do that? It is because the person was able to fit in with the environment. But where the person is unable to fit in with the environment, we find the person who cannot fit into that environment is stressed out. The stress levels of that individual who cannot fit into the organizational requirements or the environment that has been created is always stressful. And it is the same. Sometimes you land up in a foreign country. I've gone to a number of foreign countries. I was lucky to go to several foreign countries. I remember my first trip. I was 12 years old when I landed up in a very, very cold European country. And I was a total misfit. I thought I would die of the cold. My teeth were chattering. And what we thought was a sweater, which was good enough in India, was not even was serving the purpose 25%. And the sort of dress that those Europeans were wearing was entirely different. Because the best cold weather that we had seen was probably Ooty or Kodaikanal, and that too in summer, which is what was the coldest thing that we would have come across. So there we find the person is a misfit, and I did not enjoy my first few days, but it took some time for me to get used to this new environment. And when I started enjoying it, and when I started preparing for it in terms of good clothes, good food, the sleep patterns, and keeping myself busy, I was able to fit in with the environment, and my stress level started coming down. And what was seen as unpleasant turned into a very pleasant experience, which I was able to do across several countries. So the person-environment fit approach is also a great explanation of how stress needs to be approached. Finally, Harry Levinson brought out the psychoanalytical approach. This is basically built on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. He says, all that we say, all that we do is not conscious. Just below the conscious level, we have a number of things that we have stored, unable to speak of, unable to express. We have these things just below the surface. And it is that subconscious that really demands what we do. Now, following on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theory, Harry Levinson said, the whole thing is our personality issue. And he said, it starts with the ego ideal. Now, what is the ego ideal? Each one of us has a role model in our mind. This is the embodiment of a person's perfect self. You know, even teachers have that. You know, sometimes you finish a lecture and you know that you have done extremely well. How do you know you have done well? And there are times when teachers come out of the classroom, knowing that they could have done it a little better. Now, how do you decide on what is good and what is better? It is based on a benchmark. The ego ideal is that benchmark. This is the embodiment of a person's perfect self. It can be in talking, walking, relating to others, handling tight scenarios. And we say this shall be the standard. And then there is the reality part. And the reality is how the person really sees himself or herself. Now that can be positive or negative. Unfortunately, because of the world that we live in, we are constantly taught to feel negative about what we are. If you look at all the advertisements on TV, they will essentially put in a sense of negativity. If you don't have that skin tone, it's bad. You're not that tall, that's bad. You're not so thin, that's bad. You don't have that much hair, that's bad. So the self-image is being dented time and again over a time period. You don't have that car, then you're not successful. You didn't go to that college, then you're not that smart. You don't have so much money, then you're not really prosperous. You're just middle class. So therefore, what happens is that the ego ideal is a benchmark which is very far away from the self-image. And according to Harry Levinson, greater the discrepancy between the ego ideal and the self-image, greater the stress. So therefore, the individual would have to find some method in which the ego ideal and the self-image come a little closer. And for the ones who believe that the ego ideal and the self-image are one and the same or very close to each other, the stress is not felt at all. So these four approaches each explains the concept of stress from four different angles: the homeostatic or medical approach, the cognitive appraisal approach, the person-environment fit approach, or the psychoanalytical approach are not comprehensive by themselves. That we have got to remember, they are not comprehensive by themselves. Each of them gives us a very important input. By themselves, they are not complete, but when you put all of them together, you finally start understanding that stress is really a very, very complicated issue. Let's move on. Now, what happens to the stress response? It's a very interesting thing. What happens when all of a sudden, you're sitting quietly and then somebody says, so-and-so will offer the vote of thanks. It's a very simple thing. You're absolutely unprepared for it. You didn't think that somebody would call you and say, so-and-so will propose the vote of thanks. In fact, you might have not even be listening to the lecture at all because you were just an innocent bystander. What happens? Or suddenly you walk into a room and there is this big rat right in the middle of the room, staring at you with red eyes. What happens? You come home and find your door open and you have the keys in your hand. What happens? What really happens is this. The immediate reaction of the body is the blood is redirected to your brain. Why is it redirected to the brain? Because the brain is from where the command has to come. And the command center must be ready. And all the unnecessary organs can wait. The command center, must get all the blood and all the energy and all the attention possible. And after the brain, the blood will also rush to your large muscle groups. The large muscle groups are to be found in your legs and in your arms. That is the fight or the flee syndrome. So the muscles get all the blood. They get filled with blood. And where is this blood taken away from? The skin, the internal organs, and the extremities. That is why, in a stressful situation, if you were to touch somebody, they would be ice cold. Why are they ice cold? Not because the character is ice cold, because all the blood has been taken away from the skin and the internal organs slow down and the extremities are not important at all, for the simple reason. I know this is a little crude, but you should understand. You can lose a hand and still live, but you can't lose your head and live. So therefore, the extremities become less important and the blood rushes to the brain and the large muscle groups get ready to fight or to flee. Amazing. There's an increased alertness by way of improved vision. You're able to see great details all of a sudden. Is that rat moving towards me? All of a sudden, you realize that the rat's whiskers are moving rapidly. You would not have normally seen that. But then you are focused now on the rat. And this huge rat in the middle of the room is the one thing that you're looking at it. All of a sudden, you're able to see right into its eyes, how red the eyes are. Something that you would not do it. And your hearing will become even more acute. You will hear the smallest sounds possible. Sometimes you're woken up at night and you think there's a robber in the house or somebody, a stranger is in the house. You can hear the smallest scraping of furniture, the smallest fall of the newspaper on the ground, the smallest rustle of clothes, are all heard very clearly. How do you do that? Because the primitive mechanism sets in and our increased alertness to survive takes over. All other sensory processes also start becoming more sensitive. You can smell better, you can touch better and feel better. All of that happens because the brainstem, which is also called as the ancient brain, becomes the focus of all energy. And then what does happen is there's a release of glucose, blood sugar. It is given to you. Why is it given? Because when you're going to fight or flee, it means you need large dosages of energy. And this large dosages of energy, where does it come from? From the glucose. And the fatty acids that you have been storing, you can start using all those reserves now. And the fatty acids go into the bloodstream to strengthen the bloodstream. Why do we do this? To sustain the body during the stressful event. Now, you must understand something. All of this is being done in the very dangerous assumption that the stressful event is going to be only for a short time period. Maybe a few minutes, after which either you'll hit and kill this rat or you'll run away from this rat and then go and tell all the people there's a rat in the room. The body is not designed to do this for a long time. This is only for that very important phase in which you have to make a decision. Also, what happens, which is more dangerous to all of us, is that depression of the immune system. Your digestive system, your restorative systems, your healing process is all stopped. Because you see, there's only one energy battery inside you. And that battery apportions different, amounts of energy to different parts of the body. But at the point at which it decides nothing else is essential, it shuts off the supply to your restorative and emergent processes, also to your immune system, and gives all that energy only to the brain and to the big muscles. So therefore, this is one of the reasons why we fall sick, because you see, the immune system has been compromised. What should have gone to the immune system has been taken away. And then suddenly we say, I'm not hungry. I can't eat. I can't sleep. That is the restorative. Unless you sleep. Sleep is deprived because you're in a state of arousal. You need to make a decision on whether you're going to run or fight. Then, what we need to understand is, obviously, all of this, all the four stated above, help the person to change from a defensive, unprepared position to an offensive position. But this cannot be sustained. That is the problem. So stress coming and going is not a problem. But the sustained stress that we go through day in and day out, that cannot be sustained. And if it is sustained, it can cause adverse impacts physiologically, psychologically, and behaviorally. All of a sudden, you can't see. You go to a doctor and you say, I have blurred vision. And the doctor says, go to an ophthalmologist. Okay, you go to the best of the eye doctors. He checks everything and says, he can't find anything. He says, anyway, let's take an MRI. He takes an MRI. MRI also comes out. By that time, you're away from stress and you already start feeling better. And then the doctor also says, okay, take a couple of these medicines. Usually not very directly related to the disease at all. And then you feel better. And things seem to have, improved a lot. You come back to work. And then the same cycle repeats again. Why does that happen? It is because of sustained stress, which will depress your immunity, increase your blood sugar levels. The amount of fatty acids in your bloodstream is very high, leading to clots, clogs, heart attacks, cardio arrests. All of that happens essentially because of this. So therefore, this cannot be sustained. This is what happens in a typical stress response, which I want the class to understand. Now, what are the sources of work stress? Now coming to our business, where do we suffer because of this work stress? It starts from a basic classification of work demands and non-work demands. Let's first talk about the work demands. The tasks that we do today are definitely not the tasks that people were doing maybe a decade ago. So much has changed in the tasks that we do. There is uncertainty, there is unpredictability. We don't know when it starts, when it will end. Take this Corona season. Even for the teachers who had more or less predictable lifestyles, you don't know. You don't know if the student is even listening to you. Even now, I'm talking to myself. There's not a single face that I can see. It's only a hope that I'm reaching out to some 200 people. I don't know if anybody is really listening to me at all. Believe me, that is very stressful. I don't know. For all I know, there could have been a power cut 20 minutes back, and I'm still talking like an idiot in front of a small camera. I don't know.
We are listening. We are listening.
No, I'm just joking. I'm just putting it across. This uncertainty, unpredictability has now become a part of every job. And there is a lack of control. Why does this become a lack of control? Because you see, in earlier times that we lived in, we were in work situations which were easily manageable. The number of stakeholders were less. The stakeholders' interests and their stakes were also less. So a teacher can walk into a room and say, sit down. And everybody sits down. Or when a teacher walks into a class, everybody gets up and says, good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. Is that what is happening today? That's not what happens. There are still people talking. The umpteen number of people texting. You do not have control over the task. What is the task for a teacher? To teach. But the very basic task of teaching is no longer controllable because there are so many diversions. Career progress itself is no longer one straight line. Today, even for teachers, if they want to grow, let's be honest about it. They've got to jump organizations. There are many teachers that I know who joined in a college and left the college only when they retired. Today, that's not the case. I find umpteen number of applications landing up on my desk which says, I've been here for 10 years, no promotion. So I'm coming to your institute. the grass on the other side seems greener. That is a task demand. The new technologies, especially for a almost outdated person like me, I have to go to an education platform like Callpole, schedule my class, then create a link through Zoom, then come there and handle my class through that Zoom link. And then I want to conduct a quiz. I have got to use a software called, or a package called Socrative. And then I want to conduct an exam. I have to use another platform called Metal. It has become extremely stressful. All of these are making huge demands of my time. Not just time. It is challenging my status quo. I became a teacher so that I could teach. But today, to teach, I must master this technology. Otherwise, I can't teach. And the time pressures have become so much. My commuting, the administrative work, my academic work, all of these, I need to prioritize. Unfortunately, that prioritizing is not entirely in my hands. You would have noticed that even as I speak to you, I had to cut my phone 3 times. Huge priorities are being made on getting my attention. Not all of that is possible. Now, the next one is very interesting. Now, before I go into this, let me give you a small definition of what is a role. A role is a set of expectations. It is a set of expectations. So, role is not what you play. A role is what others expect you to play. Now, there can be 3 things that can happen. Role conflicts can happen because of the work that you do. Role ambiguity and role overload are all things that every one of us, the one who speaks and the one who listens, each and every one of us are affected by it. Quickly, let me take you through what each one means. In role conflicts, you have 3 types of role conflicts. One is known as inter-role conflict. What is inter-role conflict? Unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of playing only one role. Even as we are playing one role, we also are expected to play one more role. Now, sometimes, you're a friend. Right now, you're a participant. But at the same time, you're also a faculty member or a part of an organization somewhere else. What happens if your boss calls you now? Will you be a participant or will you answer your boss's call? I think, I'm not asking you, I'm just thinking. I think most of us would answer the boss's call rather than attend this meeting. Why would you do that? Because there are 2 roles to be played here. And I will sacrifice one role to play the other. But suppose I conduct a test at the end of this quiz or of this lecture, and you missed out something, you would feel bad. You will feel really bad. Why? And it creates stress. This is known as inter-role. The prioritizing between which role to be played first and which one to be played more effectively. The second thing is called the intra-role. Now, within each role, there are different parts. And playing one part of that role is easier, but very difficult to play the other part of the role. Listening to this lecture, following this lecture is okay. That's okay. But the point at which I start asking you, every 10 minutes, we'll have a quiz on what I have spoken. At the end of this, we'll have a quick test on what you have learned. Then you will find within these 2 parts, one is pleasant, easy to play, easy to understand, easy to accept. But the other part of the same role is very difficult. Therefore, this role has become confusing. There was a time when I was a teacher, 25, 30 years ago. It was a joyful time. I would come there, I would teach, and I would go. Today, I can't do that. What about admissions, they ask me. What about administrative roles, they ask me. They say, now a teacher has to do all of that. While I still want to be a teacher, The other parts that they ask me to do, the course plan, the syllabus preparation, it's all painful. I don't want to do it. That again causes stress in me. And the third thing is that some people can play some roles perfectly well. That's a personality and environment fit. But when a particular personality simply can't play a role, they can't, they've been given that role. The person can't play it. Let's say an introvert is asked to play the role of an extrovert. Very often we take up jobs like that. I specialized in marketing. I've done something in super specialized in marketing. What are you teaching now? HR. Why are you teaching HR? Because the time I joined this college, all the marketing courses were taken up by my seniors. So what are you teaching now? I'm teaching HR. Do you like it? No, I don't like it. I want to teach marketing. But I can never ever teach marketing because it's all taken up. Person, role, conflicts. We call all of them as role conflicts. Then you have role ambiguity. Role ambiguity, as the name suggests, is I don't know where my role begins and where it ends. I don't know. I'm called as a manager. What should I do? Should I be strict? Should I be a team leader? Should I be a task leader? What should I do? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Am I stepping on somebody's toes? I don't know until somebody screams. Who asked you to do this? Did you mark the attendance? I didn't know I had to mark the attendance. Did you upload it to the internet? I didn't know I had to do it. Can also happen. And in the modern workplace, I am sure everybody who's listening to this, we have all gone through this role ambiguity, where we do not know what is expected of us. And then there is a role overload. So much expectation, quantitatively and qualitatively. And they want us to deliver each day, quantitative and qualitative. Even the quantitative part we can sometimes, we work, sometimes we take work home and we finish it off there. So 8 + 2 hours at home, 10 hours of work, and you can probably meet the quantitative overload. But what about qualitative? What if suddenly they say, you have to improve your communication skills? How the hell do I improve on my communication skills? Or somebody says, from tomorrow, you must use only Excel in the workplace. And I have no idea what is Excel. I do not know what is SPSS. I do not know anything else. Such qualitative demands are also being made on all of us. And therefore, that's another major source of work stress. Then comes the interpersonal demands, the emotional toxins that we live with. We always work in teams, and not all teammates are great. Some of them are basically poisonous for various reasons. Their character, their own malfunctioning because of various other external reasons. We call them as the abrasive personalities. When they rub off on you, they take off your skin. They make you bleed. They make you feel pained because of your interaction with them. And this is happening in every organization. I've seen young teachers talk to me about the amount of abrasive personalities that are in the workplace. And you can't run away from them. The faculty room is one big room. You got to meet them every day, talk to them every day. And every day is a torture. And sexual harassment, you can't run away from this either. It is there. Earlier, it was only the women who were crying about it. Now, men are also not spared. It's happening all the time. And above all, the biggest problem as I see it in the modern workplace is poor leadership. Leaders who have become leaders by sheer seniority or by sheer loyalty, they have become leaders. And they have no qualities of leadership. They have no understanding of what is leadership. They cannot provide the support. They cannot provide the inspiration that is required to take the team forward. In all those cases, the interpersonal demands themselves will create stress in us. Then there is the physical demand, the extreme environments. Many of our environments are very, very difficult, very noisy. very hot, too much crowds who come in and walk out. Strenuous activities, walking up 3 floors. Your faculty room would be in the 3rd floor. All your classes would be spread out all over the place. Hazardous substances. There are no ways in which you can keep it. You're close to a refinery. The smells keep coming in. You live in a city. The air that you breathe in can be dangerous. It is the same for the corporate, global travel. You know, sometimes when I was traveling a lot, when I was a little younger, every airport would look the same. And sometimes I would not know whether I'm coming home or going away. I wouldn't know because I was so tired. And only when you look at your passport, you actually know, okay, I'm going from home. Oh no, I'm coming to home. It's the same, noisy, crowded offices, not great planning is given into designing workplaces. And especially in educational institutions, we have to sadly say that faculty members are not great stakeholders, or not recognized as great stakeholders. Poor ergonomics, the sort of chairs, tables that we are given, the sort of lighting in the rooms that we work in, privacy and hygiene. Can't change a dress. The toilets that we go to are forgettable experiences. All of them create huge sources of demand. But then it's not just the work which creates stress in us. The non-work demands are also real. Some of them are home demands. How many children you have? How healthy they are? Are there teenagers in them? Where are they right now? Are they studying well? Which school do they go to? Are they going to be admitted into a college? The elderly. How elderly? What sort of diet restrictions do they have? And then the concept of single parent has caught up in India. Today, more than what is reported, I know hundreds and hundreds of families in which there are single parents. It's not as if the other spouse has run away. No, the spouse is still there, but of no use. Contributes zero, zilch. In such cases, I would call them as single parents. These home demands, in addition to the work demands, can really literally kill off people. Then there are the personal demands. Each of us have our own dreams, our desires. This is self-imposed on us. I need to go to this temple. I need to visit this church. When do I do it? Only on a Sunday. I need to go and see my old parents. Haven't seen them for a long time. My sister has reported sick. I have not seen her at all. When do I go and see her? That commitments that I have made and the self-imposed, requirements that I've created for myself will also be great sources of work stress for all of us. Now, what is the consequences of stress? Now, this is where we want to look at it. If it is eustress, there is increased arousal. There is bursts of physical strength. There is full engagement. And health-wise, cardiovascular efficiency, balance in the nervous system, enhanced focus in an emergency. All of that is good. But what if it is bad? To the individual, it results in psychological disorders, medical illness, behavioral problems, and for the organization, participation issues, disengagement, performance decrements. The team that seemed extremely good until last year suddenly seems to have disintegrated. What do you give as a compensation? When there is no performance, and the lesser the compensation, even lesser the performance, isn't it? During the Corona period, I know any number of colleges stopped making payments for their vacation time period. Some colleges cut their salary. Some colleges refused increments. How would that impact the employee? It would be great stress on the employee. Now, let's take a look at the individual's, stress-strain relationship. Very interesting studies have come out. We generally believe that men are stronger, men are more physically robust, and therefore men should be able to handle stress much better than women. But the truth is that men are not necessarily better than women. In fact, women have shown extreme resilience when it comes to overcoming stress. One of the reasons why they are so resilient and are able to better combat stress is because women have been multitasking for a long time, much longer than men. Men have always only focused on any one activity that they can do well, which is basically breadwinning. Whether it was the agriculture era or the hunting era, men were only focusing on that. But women were managing children, society, wealth, all of that they have been doing it traditionally. And because of that, in my opinion, women are actually much better handling stress than men. Now, then also it's a question of personality. We know that type A behavior pattern is the go-getters, the ones who get you the results. Unfortunately, these are the people who fall prey to stress. And that is why at the beginning, when I was talking about the corporate world, why you cannot find people above 70 normally in the corporate world is because most who reach the top of the ladder are type A behaviors. And these type A behaviors are typically made that in a short time period, they get the best of the results. Unfortunately, they don't last. They don't have a shelf life. And the type A behaviors also burn out quickly. This is a reality that we have got to live with. Then comes the question of personality hardiness. We find that some personalities, you listen to them and you wonder, how did they do this? The other day I was reading about Nelson Mandela. And reading about Nelson Mandela, 19 years, 20 years in prison. What do you do? 20 years in a small room, all by yourself. Now, nobody to talk to. No good food. No distractions. Very, very basic of the hygiene factors will be provided to you. How does anybody do that? Again, I was reading the book Robinson Crusoe on a single island. Or if you had seen the movie Castaway, in which Hank Sachs, he is castaway on an island, and he has only this football that he keeps talking to, and he spends a long time there, wondering why is he not going mad as yet. And we find that some people are built to take a beating and still stand. To them, stress does not impact them as much as it impacts others. So the social scientists put their heads together and came up with a concept called personality hardiness. And they said, when the personality is hard, they are able to view things differently and also handle things very differently. Now they found out there were 3 parameters in which they excelled. One was commitment. And the opposite of commitment is alienation. When given a task, any task, the personality hardy people were the ones who believed that they had a personal commitment to the achievement of that task. And on the other end of the continuum, you would have the people who would alienate and say, why this sudden change has been brought in? I don't like what is going on. We were coming to college at 9 o'clock. Why should we come at 8 o'clock? The moment you start saying, instead of 9 o'clock, now I have to get up early, come to college at 8 o'clock itself. What do I do for breakfast? How do I prepare food for people at home? You have already alienated yourself from the task. You've moved away from the task. But the ones who are committed to it and who say, good, I'll come at 8, I'll leave at 4 instead of 5. I can beat the traffic. I can go home and be with my family for 1 more hour. That is a commitment. And you will find that personality hardy people first reveal this commitment. Whereas the stress-filled ones have already alienated themselves. And because of their alienation, their stress level goes up. And the second quality about the personality hardy people is that They perceive they have control over anything. Personally, my biggest role model is my father. He came from a small village. There were no godfathers for him. There was nobody there out to support him. And he had no money when he landed up in Chennai. He had a wife who was a teacher. He had 2 small girls at that time. With nothing at all, he came to Chennai and created an amazing career for himself. And I keep asking time and again, how did he do that? Why did he not despair? Why did he not give up? Because of the simple reason he believed that he was in control of life. He believed that he could change his fate. He believed that he could dictate terms. That is an amazing belief that he had in himself, and it paid off. And it paid off. On the other end of that continuum is the powerlessness. Very often we despair easily. We say, oh my God, I've been transferred. What do I do? I've lost this opportunity. I've not been promoted. What do I do? Every single fall is seen as final. And we feel absolutely powerless, because of which our stress levels also go up. And the third thing about personality hardy people is that they look at every situation as a challenge, not as a threat. Sometimes, we start our scooter in the morning, the scooter doesn't start. We say, oh my God, today is a very bad day. Everything is gone. Nothing. Today is a very unlucky day. Whereas the personality hardy people say, okay, wonderful. I always wanted to ride on the metro. Today I get the chance to do that. I'll take that challenge. Okay, today the food that I made has gone bad. I don't see it as a threat. I see it as a challenge. I'll say, okay, this food shall go. I will try that new restaurant that I have not eaten in. Or I'll try that food that I wanted to eat. And you will find in commitment, control, and challenge, you find positives that bring about transformational coping. We are now talking about changing stressful scenarios. How does it come about? It comes from this personality hardiness that we can build into us. It is possible to change a weak personality into a tougher personality. Self-reliance is good. The more self-reliant you are, it's great. When I was a kid, my mom taught me how to make a dosa when I was probably 7, 8 years old. She taught me all that was basic cooking. And it made me terribly independent, because I felt more confident that I could go and survive in any scenario. I still see many men especially struggling. They can't make their own cup of tea. They can't. They are so dependent on somebody, they go there and beg them. The greater the self-reliance, the lesser your stress levels. Make yourself self-reliant. Do you know how to ride a car? No, I don't know how to drive a car. Dead. You're dead. You're dependent. The moment you say, I don't know, you've become dependent. Do you know how to make this dish that you really love? No, my mother used to make it. Your mother is no more. Why are you talking about her? How long would it take for you to learn that new thing? The more self-reliance you show, the lesser the stress. Most of the situations that we find ourselves is because, I've talked to young women. I say, I have not learned. I am not educated. I don't have a job. So therefore, no matter how wayward my husband is, I have to put up with him. Obviously, the girl's life is going to be challenged. She's going to lead a very stressful life because she's absolutely dependent on somebody. Talking about self-reliance, there are also 3 concepts that you need to understand better. One is interdependence. Interdependence is good. That is why, we encourage marriage. 1 plus 1. Get together. 2 heads are better than 1. Let's do that. So you depend on her, or she depends on you. It's fine. Here, what is created is synergy is created in interdependence. What each one of you individually cannot achieve, can be achieved only when the two of you come together. Now that can be a family, that can be an organization. Find out such interdependence, positive relationships. They are there. It can be interdisciplinary, it can be interdepartmental. Go do that. But there is also another negative about the counterdependence. Now, this is a new concept that has come through. This counterdependence goes like this. In counterdependence, what happens is that people say that they are self-reliant. And they're also in good relationships with others. But you know what? Every day, when they have to take a report from somebody, or every day when they have to take an input from somebody, they hate it. They detest it. They feel as if they have become indebted because of this dependence. So they'll say, I'm happy in my marriage. But they hate their spouses. They say, I'm great in my organization. They don't talk to anybody in the organization. They don't even talk to their boss. And then comes overdependence. That's the other edge, where we completely depend on somebody else, even to get our own tasks completed. That again is a dangerous thing. Okay, fine. So what can we do? Preventive stress management. Ideally, we would not like stress to happen to us. We need to prevent stress before it happens. One is known as primary prevention. This is intended to reduce, modify, or eliminate the stressor causing demand. It can be task, role, physical, and interpersonal demands. You know, I don't know about you. I come from a rural part of Tamil Nadu in which you have these small tea shops. And in these small tea shops, they would have written something. Don't talk politics here. And I have wondered, why do they say don't talk politics here? Because you see what happens is each political discussion starts off very lightly. And then soon it picks up heat. And then people start shouting at each other, finally coming to blows. And you know whose business goes out of sync? It is the poor tea shop owner's thing. So he knows this. He has seen plenty of these incidents. So he knows every time they talk about politics, it's going to end up in a fight. And it's going to spoil business for the tea shop owner. So he puts up this board which says, don't talk politics here. Or sometimes they put up a board which says, credit spoils relationships or breaks relationships. It starts off with 1 cup of tea and the person puts his hand into his pocket and says, I have only 100 rupee note. Tomorrow I'll pay you. And then tomorrow he has 2 cups of tea and he says, at the end of this week, I'll pay you. But by the end of the week, it has become quite a sizable amount. And then he says, I'll pay at the end of the month. Slowly, the good relationship that he had with the tea shop owner is lost. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that if there is a stressor, and you know that it is a stressor, first let us identify the stressor to remove it. Today, we need to become more sensitive in knowing what is the stressor. You know, what is the stressor? Most people fight on the same issue. I call this such people as idiots. You know, the last time you discussed this, there was a fight. Why would you talk about it again? Especially when you do not want to resolve it, but simply because it's an ego issue. So therefore, don't do that. If you know that a task, a role, a physical demand or interpersonal demand is the stressor, try to address the stressor. Or in other words, remove the stressor if possible. If possible. It's not always possible, but if it is possible, remove it. That one thing which irritates people, the one thing that brings about a stressful situation, if it is possible, take it away from your life. Let it not be a part of your life. But then, what if your boss is your stressor? You can't remove your boss. Correct? You can't run away from your boss. Your boss, your HOD, your principal, your director is a stressor. Therefore, what you can do is secondary prevention. which is intended to alter or modify the individual's or the organization's response to the demand or a stressor. Every morning before you start for college or for your work, you tell yourself, I am going to meet a very demanding director, a very demanding boss. And in the process of my interaction, he or she will irritate me. But I will not take it as a personal insult. I will change the perception of the stressor and say that this is a part of my life. It will not kill me. It will not diminish my value. It will not take away my integrity. I can live with it, which we call as secondary prevention. When you change the perception of stress, that is called secondary prevention. And the third is tertiary. Despite all your best efforts, whether it is primary or secondary, sometimes you are hurt. Stress reaches out to you and you're hurt in the process. In such cases, we would intend to heal these individual or organization symptoms of stress. For the individual, the tertiary prevention is looking at the behavioral changes that have happened, the psychological changes that have happened. Simple tests. Are you happier than last year? Are you healthier than last year? Do you have more medical problems than last year? Are you seeing the doctor more than last year? Are you speaking more to your boss than the last 6 months? Are you speaking to your spouse much better now? Are you connecting with your children better than before? All of which should tell you what is the amount of stress that you're going through. And the organization can also work out its direct and indirect costs. Okay, we have come almost to the end. This is literally the end of the lecture, as I promised, 90 minutes or so. So let's look at this. What can be organizations and individuals do to prevent stress? Some of these are everyday, but some of these are a little bit more difficult to implement. What you need is the will to put it in practice. From the organizational viewpoint, we have started talking about job redesigns. For a long time, organizations have been talking about creating jobs and then finding the people to fit into the job. Always, this is the job description. And based on this job description, you better fit into it. But that's not always the smartest thing, because there are some very talented people who become misfits because they don't fit into your ready-made role definitions. In such cases, organizations have started thinking about redesigning jobs. One of the things that they have started thinking about is, when this job is done, does it result in job satisfaction for the individual? Because earlier job designs were all about efficiency and effectiveness. All of the jobs were designed only for these two, were to bring out people's efficiency and effectiveness. But now, jobs are being redesigned. Not everywhere, not in every organization, but liberated organizations have started thinking that when a job is done, the consequences of the job must be pleasant for the individual. Maybe you're leaders of some organization. Maybe you're leaders of small teams. When you go back to your work next Monday, look at the jobs that you ask your subordinates to do. Look at ways and means by which you can redesign the job without compromising on the core achievements that needs to be met. Help people. And when you redesign these jobs, organizations can actually bring down individual stress levels. Another thing that organizations can do is goal setting. Goal setting is not one big target that you draw and ask people to shoot arrows at. That's not what goal setting is. Goal setting is in terms of individual capabilities. What are the individual capabilities? What are the special talents? And what is their ultimate potential? And a goal needs to be set for the short term, for the medium term, and for the long term. More importantly in goal setting is instant feedback on achievements, on deviations, must be immediately given. Today, I know organizations which do evaluation once in a year. Too late. There is no time for course corrections. Only towards the end, everybody wakes up. They're all tired. They don't know what to do. So they do something. Publish papers, publish papers, publish papers. It must be in the Scopus, it must be indexed, it must be ABDC, it must be A-star, it must be the A-list. Yes, all of that is nice. But can all write A-star journals? So what happens? People start publishing papers, paying money. Let us not shy away from it. We have ghost writers who will get your papers published. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, and they will get it done. That's not the way it's done. Role negotiations. As I said, a role is a set of expectations. Let organizations be open to allow role negotiations. In my institute, we have these small role negotiations possible. Normally, we work for 6 days a week. But you can negotiate and say, I'll come only for 5 days. Obviously, your salary will be reduced by that amount. But that's possible. You can say. And we had an administrative officer who said, I can come in only at 9 o'clock. And they said, fine, 9 to 5, you can work. Small role negotiations can and should be permitted. A single mother, aged parent to take care of, would all demand that people be allowed to do role negotiations. Where organizations allow these role negotiations, we have come a long way. I know big institutes that I don't want to name of, private institutions, which say you log in anytime you want, but you spend 8 hours here. And you log out only after 8 hours. I think that's good. That's a good role negotiation that we find here. Also, the social support system. We have things like the ICC, in the Internal Complaints Committee. Have they ever met? Do they ever do anything at all? Once in a while they meet, they write up the minutes. That is because it's an NIR requirement or because it's an accreditation requirement. We do it. There are social support systems which are not working. They are not working. Sadly, organizations need to build this network. Already people are feeling as if they are working at an elevated position. And should they fall down, is there a net that will protect me? That net is provided by the social support system. It can be counselors. It can be a buddy system. It can be peer counseling. There are so many different social support systems which are available. The question to be asked is, what social support systems are there in your organization? And you as a leader, what can you go and promote in your organization? Think about that. And then, as an individual, you and me, what can we do? Number one is positive thinking. We have, you've sort of become pessimistic in the way that we have approached life. If you were to ask any of our people, do you think the Indian political situation will improve? No. Will India ever become Singapore? No. Do you think we'll become as clean as a European city? No. Nothing. And you can always see, 70 years after independence, we are still here. That doesn't help. Positive thinking is one way in which you energize yourself. And you see, to fight stress, you need energy. Why are we not positive? Because yesterday has been bad. And day before yesterday has been bad. And so we assume that today is going to be bad. This is a pattern that we are building and we are imagining because it was bad yesterday. Because it was bad day before yesterday. Today has to be bad and tomorrow bad. Not necessary. There is no proof. There is no scientific proof that because you've had a bad past, that your future will also be bad. There is no science to it. It is just your imagination. All you got to do is close your eyes for a moment and tell you, my life will be what I imagine. Do that. My life will be what I imagine. If you imagine your life to be fulfilling, it will be fulfilling. If you imagine your life to be complete, comprehensive, it will be. If you imagine your life to be bad, believe me, it will be bad. It will be bad. Another thing that I find among young, old professionals is that they have no idea about what is time. Usually I give them a small exercise. When I do this MDP programs, I do a small exercise. I ask all of them to stand up for a moment and close their eyes. You can also do this exercise later on. I ask all of them to stand up, close their eyes and say, when you think it is 1 minute, when you think 1 minute has completed, you can sit down. And you know what happens? Nobody sits when it is one minute. Many of them sit before it is 1 minute. A few sit well after it is 1 minute. The point I try to tell people is that when you cannot gauge what is 1 minute, how are you going to handle 24 hours in a day? Time management is a question of not increasing time, but prioritizing activities. There is the urgent and the most needy, and the other activities would all depend on this. So therefore, time management is about prioritizing what we do. Third thing, many people seem to have no leisure time activities. You see, leisure time activities are not just wasting your time. They are your healing time. They are called as the recoupment time. The time in which you get back your positive energy is the leisure time activity. So therefore, each one of us must have at least 30 minutes of leisure time each day. Set it apart. Your family will demand that 30 minutes. I promise you, they will do that. But you have to stand firm and say, in the morning, I'll go for a walk for 30 minutes, no matter what happens. No matter whose dinner or lunch or breakfast goes for a toss, I don't care. This 30 minutes, I will walk. This is my time. I will watch this news. I will watch this movie. I will meet with friends. Do it. Initially, it may seem a little bit selfish, but you need that healing time. If you don't have the healing time, you're never ever going to get better. Also, please do physical exercise, because there is a direct connection between physical exercise and the way that you handle stress. People who do moderate exercise, don't do this heavy, mad exercises. Maybe that can be done by some very young people, but I normally do not recommend that. Moderate exercise is good, because with moderate exercise, you don't tire your body too much. And also, you don't exhaust yourself. There is also joy in moderate exercise. Taking a quiet walk for an hour, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Do that, anything. It can be yoga, it can be anything that you want, but make it almost a ritual. Every day this has to be done. Relaxation training also helps. I'm reminded of this joke. So this man has an anger issue. So the doctor says the next time you get angry, count up to 10 before you do anything stupid. So the man comes to the doctor the next day and says, "Doctor, I counted till 10. And the doctor says, "What happened?" Then I hit him twice as hard because he made me wait for 10. Of course, it's just a joke. A relaxation training is entirely different. This is about taking your mind away from that which is stressing you. So relaxation training is any task, any activity. It can be gardening, it can be painting, it can even be singing, even if you're not a good singer. Just express yourself. But one thing you have to remember, that relaxation must result in relaxation. Sometimes, people think relaxation means going to the bar and taking a couple of drinks and then you become relaxed. No, you only become more tired. You don't really relax. Also, stress can be beaten with diet. Moderate diet. A diet that fits your age and your physique. You've got to be careful about that. And the amount of liquids intake that you have. We know very well that we Indians live in very warm climates. So anything between 2 to 3 liters of water is a necessary part of our diet. Also have somebody that you can open up. But trust people with caution. Don't go up and open up everything about your family to that person simply because they're listening to you. And then suddenly you find there's a lot of gossip about your family. Don't do that. Open up, but open up with people that you trust. When you talk with somebody else, number one, you ease off, you vent, you give, some space for the negative energy to move out. Number two, it may actually end up with some good advice from the other person. Something that the other person might tell you what to do, what not to do, and so on. If in spite of all of this, you still feel very stressful, please seek professional help. It is not wrong to see a psychiatrist. It is not wrong to see a psychologist. Today, I know a number of people who badly require professional help. I know a young woman who was going through a very tough time in her life. She was complaining of back pain, severe back pain. She could not sit. So every form of treatment was given to her. And on the last time she went to see the doctor, I also went with her. And I sat with the doctor and asked her, after this girl had gone out, what is wrong with this girl? And the doctor said something that I think I must share with you. He said this is called as transference. That is something which is psychological and she can't sort it out. She transfers it to her body and they call it as transference. This transference could be seen in all of us. Many of the physical symptoms that we are exhibiting because of stress is because we can't solve it at that level, but we give it a physical transference and we seek help for that. That is a sad state of affairs that we should not permit any one of us to get into. So with that, I would like to close my talk on organizational stress and well-being. I wish all of you all the very best, and I hope that you all stay well and that you overcome stress, if at all stress should strike you. Okay, so let me just close my presentation, and Mr. Alok seems to have put up a hand. Yes,
sir.
Mr.
Sir, I have attended, I guess, more than 4 or 5 sessions on this topic, and I would say this is the best session I have ever attended so far.
Thank you, sir.
Because you have treated this topic in a very scientific manner, in a very lucid manner, right? And
Thank you, sir.
That is one. I also want to learn from you that how to create eustress, because that's the positive side, right? So is there any mechanism so that we can create eustress ourselves?
Yes, yes, you can, sir. Now, before you create eustress, sir, you have to find out where you can be at your creative best. There are points at which we are the creative best. Sometimes the creative best is inside a classroom teaching. Sometimes the creative best is in the sports field. Sometimes the creative best is in the kitchen making something new. Now, you need to find out what is your creative best. Once you have decided on what is your creative best, then you can channelize your energy to create that eustress. Today I was reading the newspaper. A very ordinary young lady had created a world record of creating 124 dishes. 124 dishes in, believe it or not, 30 minutes. 124 dishes in 30 minutes. And some of us might, simply push it away and say, what is the point? How can anybody do anything? But you see, that's exactly. She found out what was her creative best, and she channelized all her energy. And can you imagine the amount of stress on her during that 30 minutes when the clock was ticking and the ingredients that she had to use was also dwindling, and when people were watching? Tremendous pressure. But that was eustress, where she did all of that and finally emerged a winner. In my opinion, even if she had made only 120 dishes, she still would be a winner. She doesn't need an India World Record certificate. The sheer joy, as in organizational behavior, we teach that it should not be the consequences of the work that makes you happy. It should be the process of the work. That is, work itself should make you happy.
Exactly.
The joy of doing the work is the greatest joy, not the consequences, because the consequences can change from time to time. So do find your potential best and channelize your energies there. You will always be under eustress. You will always be doing great things. And even if you fail, you will do well and you will feel good about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, anybody else? Nisha ma'am, Nazar.
Yeah, I'm Nisha here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, sir. I'm like, I actually have heard about you, but the first time I'm listening to you.
Thank you, ma'am.
And it's wonderful, seriously wonderful. Somebody who can give so much of clarity and transparency on a concept like this is amazing. And you are, what you have told exactly, we could actually, put it into practice or see it from morning till evening in our workplaces.
Absolutely.
It literally works. And the way you have put it in what, when you were talking about the stress when you enter the department and, during
Yes.
the time, it was
Yes.
like, recalling what we were actually undergoing, all of us.
Yes,
Not just the
I
department,
underwent that too.
department. Yeah. So that was something which we could connect to. So that was very interesting. And what I felt, most of us, I have a very simple question. My question is this, Dr. Jawahar. Is it like when we do a particular work for a longer period of time, there is a kind of, incompetency that comes in. We are like bored. We do not want to do it anymore. Like in the sense, like, no, we already know it kind of a concept. And then when you're 20, 23 years into it, then you are sitting and thinking, today morning I was thinking, what the heck? What should I be doing for the next 10 years, 11 years? Like, should I be doing the same thing? And then I may kick the bucket in the next 20 years. So where am I spot on? What should I do? And then I thought maybe it is a stress level that is working on me, or is it truly that I should look for a change? I have no idea. But what is your suggestion, Dr. Jawahar? Does everybody go through this? Or is it just me? Like
No, it's an amazing question. And when you asked that question, I was transported in time. I started off with a bang as a teacher. And then I was all enthused about teaching. And then suddenly, like all good teachers, there was a burnout period for me. And I felt, oh my God, is management education at all? Are we conning these people? What are we really doing? All sorts of questions started cropping up in my mind. And I think it's only natural human that you should have this doubt. All of humanity has grown because of this self-doubt. If you do not have this doubt, then there's something wrong. So my response to it at that point of time, when I was at NIT Trichy, is that I decided, I'll do something different. And there was a place close by called REC TechStep. STEP stands for Science and Technology Entrepreneurs Park. And they were training all sorts of young people from rural places and things like that. They usually came from very disadvantageous, social status positions. And I found a great opportunity. And I said, in addition to that, what I'm doing and where I'm getting drained, I will go out here And even if I'm not getting paid well, I will talk to these people. And for the first time in my life, I was challenged to give my classes in Tamil. Because all the while I had studied in English, all the while my whole life was about thinking in English, delivering in English. And here I had to speak not in chaste Tamil, but in the local dialect Tamil that they would understand. Believe me, that was a useless moment for me. I decided to convert all my slides into Tamil, to convert all my handouts into Tamil. I started translating everything and I started practicing it. It was almost like, like a teenager, I was in love. All of a sudden, all the energy started flowing inside me. And you know what? It actually did well in my other area in which I was draining. Because you see, that sort of transference happened because I found energy in one area and I could bring that energy into another area in which I lacked. So I did this again. A little later, I joined the Tamil Nadu Open University. And in the Open University, you don't teach at all. There's absolutely no teaching. And here was a task before me. So what do I do as a teacher when I don't teach? My core characteristic had been taken away. Then I would have to speak through my lesson writing. The lessons that you write have to speak what the teacher would normally do. Again, I can quote any number of experiences that I went through, and I loved all of them. And if I feel a lot more confident and more energetic, even at my age, is essentially because I allowed this variety to come into my life. And most people feel drained and burnt out because they keep doing this one single task all the time. Add some variety, throw in some spice, take up new activities that are very different. I've done all sorts of crazy things. I've given lectures on All India Radio, which nobody listens to. But the joy was when somebody wrote on a postcard, they are no longer available now. Somebody wrote on a postcard saying, I listened to you and it was great. And then I suddenly realized that, radio talk that I thought nobody was listening to, there was somebody listening. And that somebody appreciated and wrote a postcard, 15 paise postcard, and said that that lecture was good. So that, Nisha ma'am, is my answer to you. Don't give up. You're a great teacher.
I think I'll have to look for my spices now.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's great listening to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Kavita ma'am, can I have?
Yes, ma'am. We still have 12 more minutes to finish.
Okay. It's a very nice, what you can say, a strength given to us, sir. And the thing is, it's a live telecast what you have shown us at the time of COVID, because all of us as a professor and everyone was facing the same problem, like how we are going to recover the COVID situation and pandemic, and all were in the strengths. So whatever you have given in this lecture, it is a live telecast. And second, all ever what you say, it is a positive vibes I find it in myself. Nowhere I find any negative vibes. So if we are starting implementing and taking the step, already I have started taking my stress as my opportunities. If everyone is going to do like this as an opportunity, we are going to be a winner. But one thing I want to like your advice, because it's a right platform where I can ask. See, we all of us are doing best in a COVID. We are doing online, like the simple example are you and me, and we are doing best. But what happened? We are not getting any appreciation, reward, no, nothing we are getting. So it's a one type of stress we are getting after doing lot of work. We are not getting appreciation and we are getting demotivated. I'm right? So in that case, how we are going to remove this strength and how we are going to make it as a positive vibes? This is my question.
Two things, ma'am. Two things. One, I'm happy that the vibes are good, because you see, these good vibes are infectious. When you're feeling good, the people around you also feel good. So it is important that we feel good. And when we feel bad, others around also feel bad. That's one part. The second thing is about appreciation. Yes, all of us go through this crisis. You know, essentially, I look at teachers as performers. We are basically performers. No matter what we say, we are performers. And we like a stage. The stage is a stage on which you stand and the students say, it's wonderful. You know, even now as I speak, I have given a performance and I'm happy that so many hands are clapping, which is good. But there are times when the hands don't clap and when I don't get that appreciation. And then suddenly comes the self-doubt. Am I doing the right thing? Or is it just that the people around me have become ungrateful? What is the problem? You know, luckily, I came across something that I want. Whether time permits or not, please go and read it. It is called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy or Theory. Rational Emotive Behavior Theory, REBT. If you Google it, it will come out. You can take even a one-page thing. You know, the beauty about this REBT, let me just explain to you. And whenever I feel down like this, is that, do I need anybody to congratulate me? Do I need acknowledgement from somebody to feel good? This is a conditioning. We have become like the Pavlovian dog. Right from school, we have been conditioned to feel good only when there is acknowledgement. So when you do well in school, they say first rank. And only when the first rank is given, you feel good. Or when they say distinction, you feel good. So for a long time, we have been conditioned that to feel happy, you have to depend on others to feel happy. Whether it's your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, your students, and so on. It is actually a very sad state of affairs that we have been conditioned to feel like this. We were all made individually, and then we created society. But as individuals, we must learn to appreciate ourselves. We must learn to appreciate ourselves. Now, the rational emotive behavior therapy says, or theory says, if you say good morning to somebody and somebody doesn't even reply to you, we feel slighted, we feel insulted. How dare this person? But the rational emotive behavior theory says, should they say good morning to you? Is there a rule which says that they must say good morning to you? Or if you wear a good sari to college, should somebody notice and say, this sari looks good on you? And if they don't say, does it mean that the sari is no longer good looking on you? That is the next level. Probably some other time, another chance that Kavita ma'am gives me, I will talk about REBT. And you will find it's an amazing topic in which it questions our belief system. Our belief system is what makes us happy or unhappy. Our belief systems are taught to us by the societies that we live in. And they tell you, this is the set of beliefs that you must hold on to. And as long as you hold on to these beliefs, it pays you. But the truth is that you don't need to depend on anybody else. You don't need to, we are all basically independent. We were all created like that. But because of societal reasons, we have come together as a society. But that does not mean individually we have no value. And our value need not be acknowledged or appreciated only by somebody else to prove that it is there. You can see, ma'am, if I say something, you should not mistake me. You can look in the mirror and say, not bad, Dr. Ritu. You are a Dr. Ritu. You're a Dr. Ritu. You're not just some XYZ walking down the street. You're Dr.
And what you are saying, from the last 6 months, I'm doing like this only. I'm highly demotivated from the last 6 months, but what I am doing now, the same positive vibes I'm getting. So what you say I'm doing, the happiness does not lies in others. The happiness lies in yourself. I'm doing like this only. Okay.
It is not easy. Dr. Ritu, let me tell you, it's not easy. It's not
Yes.
easy. It can't be done overnight. But you see,
Yes.
it is changing our belief systems that individually I'm good. Individually, I can be happy. I am good looking enough.
Yes.
I am rich enough. I'm qualified enough. These are beliefs that you should create in yourself. The feeling of inadequacy becomes more when we find that we do not find acknowledgement from others. So the
Yes.
wife who makes this beautiful meal for her husband, he eats quietly, not even saying one word about how good the food is very disappointing. But the REBT says, is he eating or not? The proof of the pudding is in the eating, not in the praising. See, I'm giving you an example. If it was bad, he would not eat it. The fact that he's eating it says the food is good. But you are waiting for the words that say the food is good. Proof of the pudding is the eating, and he's eating it. So it's your belief system that has to change. And when the belief system changes, all changes. You're content with life. You're content. You flow like the river, and it will happen. Yes, Dr. Ritu. Thank you. So shall we call it a day? How does it go?